I'm Mark Zaccaria. This is Common Sense. Welcome. This is the program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your life and come up with common sense solutions. And I'm thrilled today to be on the campus of Bryant University in the Hassenfeld Center for Public Leadership with its founding director, Gary Sass. Gary, thank you very much for taking time with us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, it's going to be great for our viewers to hear some of what's going on in your world right now. And as I understand it, I'd like to start by asking a little bit about term limits. I know that that's a hot topic for you these days. And if you can just briefly summarize, and then we can get into some of the details.
Okay, well, in the state of Rhode Island, we already have term limits for the general offices. The governor, the general treasurer, the attorney general, the secretary of state are limited to 2 terms. We don't have any kind of term limits for members of the legislature. And in many ways, the legislature is the strongest branch of state government. It writes the laws, it exercises oversight, it approves appointments to the governor's cabinet. And so there are 2 types of term limits to think about when you think about the legislature. One is a term limit on the number of terms a person can get elected to the legislature, and another is a limit on the number of terms a person can serve in a leadership position. So we looked very closely at that issue and came to the conclusion that trying to get term limits, limiting the number of terms a member could serve, would be very difficult. It would require a constitutional change, and the probability is very high that the leadership would never ever put that on the ballot. And second, there are pros and cons on term limits for membership. You know, some of the cons are that lobbyists get stronger, staff gets stronger at the expense of our elected representatives. So we think that's an issue that needs further study. But as far as term limits for the leadership are concerned, and when I talk about term limits for the leadership, I'm talking about the Speaker, I'm talking about the Senate President, speaking about majority and minority leaders, and chairman of committees.
Holding those leadership offices, not necessarily holding a seat in the chamber.
Right. If there's no limit on the number of terms they can serve, they'll serve as much as the people in their district want them to. But in terms of serving in leadership positions, there's no limitation. And we know this, that Rhode Island has one of the most centralized leadership regimens in the country of any legislature. So the leaders are making the rules, the leaders are doing committee assignments, the leaders discipline members. You remember on the toll vote, there were 3 or 4 people that didn't vote with the Speaker, and they were history the next day, and as far as their committee assignments were concerned. And we don't vote for the Speaker, we don't vote for the Senate President. We vote for members of the legislature. And yet there's no limit on terms, so it's very possible to gerrymander a district and someone could get elected to serve in a leader position as long as they wanted to. And it creates, I think, potential abuses of power. We've seen scandals in the legislature. The former Speaker is in federal prison. The chairman of the House Finance Committee resigned in disgrace. So there's an arrogance of power. There's not any direct public oversight. And so what we're suggesting is, for a number of reasons, that we limit the number of terms a person can serve in a leadership position to 6 years. Now, that shouldn't be very disruptive, because we went back and looked at what the average tenure was of House speakers, and it was a little under 7 years. So a 6-year limit on terms is not going to be this great disruptive thing, but it'll have a number of positive advantages.
Let me just ask one quick question. Let's go right to the nuts and bolts of how you do that. I mean, if the leadership makes all the rules and you're asking them to make a rule that they don't see is in their best interests, who's got a big enough stick to make that happen?
Well, I think we have to use the bully pulpit. There are 12 states in the country that limit the terms of leadership, how long they can serve in a leadership position. Some is done by statute, some is by custom, and some is by rules. And I think the arrogance of power of the legislature is pretty clear. Whether it was ethical issues, whether it was tolls, people are dissatisfied with how decisions are made, and people are very dissatisfied with the ability to have their representatives effectively represent their points of view. So it's a political issue. It's very difficult. You fight an uphill battle. But I've gotten a call since we put this out from several people in the legislature about how can we work to change the rules? How can we start this conversation? And so, like anything else, when you challenge the status quo, particularly in a state where one party is so strong, it's not easy. But it's building a coalition. It's electing people who are interested. It takes time, but there are really dividends to the people from doing that. First of all, go to an average member of the legislature and say, who are you representing? Are you representing your constituents, or are you representing the speaker? And I'm not sure what the answer would be. So the benefits, from this kind of approach, it encourages innovation and new thinking. There are a lot of very good people that serve in the Rhode Island legislature. But
so what you're suggesting is that we propose it to existing leadership as the best half measure that they can get to look like they're moving forward, but without having to give up all of their authority.
And I think if you're honest about it, you do need a strong leadership system in a legislative body. Just imagine if every member of the legislature, all 113, were free agents. We'd have a political Tower of Babel. It needs to be disciplined. We're seeing some of the problems in the United States Congress right now.
I was just going to say, I close my eyes and I see the Congress of the United States.
So it's not a question of trying to weaken leadership. It's a question of building a legislative system.
I'm not weakening leadership, but you are asking them to give something away.
Well, we're asking them to give something away that encourages new thinking, encourages innovation, enables representatives and senators to be more representative of their constituents. We're saying involve the backbenchers more in setting the legislative agenda. We're saying these kind of limitations on amassing power will limit the abuse of power. Lord Acton's famous statement, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, look around. And then we're also talking about parity. The Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate in Rhode Island are as influential as the governor.
Some would argue more so.
Well, the governor's term limited. These, ladies and gentlemen, are not term limited. So there's a question of balance. So I think there are a lot of reasons for more representative, more responsive, more small d, democratic government by putting a term limit on. Because the power of the Speaker of the House, the power of the Senate President, compared to their peers in other places, is significant. And I think this is a way to open the process up.
Do you think that your fallback position there is to go to a constitutional amendment if you have to?
Well, I said I don't know about that, because putting a limit on a leadership position means that you've got to go back and look in the Constitution and make sure that those positions are actually in the Constitution, which I'm not sure they are.
It might not be.
I led an effort a couple of years ago to have a constitutional convention. It was turned down. Big labor, big Democratic forces.
Big status quo.
Refused to support it. So it's much more difficult in some ways to amend the Constitution. In other ways, if you create a public uproar, concern, then the legislature can put a constitutional question on a ballot. But I'm willing, because I don't think we have all the answers, to put term limits on leadership positions and give some flexibility. If they don't work, then you change the rule.
Gary, we just have a few seconds left. How do you rate your chances? What do you think the odds are that this can happen?
Well, it's going to take a lot of education, a lot of work. It's going to take electing people to the legislature to have this conversation with you. So it's going to be difficult, but the next scandal may be behind the corner, and so we'll find out.
Gary, I thank you very, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, please stand by, because this is the first of 4 segments of time that we're going to have with Gary Sasse here today. But right now, take a break, because I believe someone is going to ask the satiric question, are you kidding me?